The wind cut across the barren plateau in long invisible waves, carrying dust that clung to every crevice of her rifle and stung the corners of her eyes, but she didn't blink. Not once. She was a statue, draped in camouflage netting, her prone body perfectly aligned behind the sleek length of a custom-built sniper rifle. The metal was cool beneath her cheek, the matte black finish absorbing the dim early morning light, and every muscle in her body was locked into a position she'd been holding for over 3 hours. Her breathing was slow, measured, and disciplined, syncing with the steady thump of her heartbeat that seemed too loud in the silence around her. Through the scope, the world transformed into something narrow and focused, a tunnel of clarity framed by crosshairs that were anchored on a distant ridgeline nearly 3 kilometers away. At this range, the man she was targeting was little more than a speck of movement, a shadow that paced near a fortified bunker surrounded by guards. But she knew his face by heart, had studied every detail of his posture, his habits, even the way he shifted his weight from one leg to the other when he thought no one was watching. He was a warlord responsible for countless deaths, a man who controlled entire regions through fear, drugs, and violence. Taking him out would destabilize his network and save thousands of lives. That knowledge didn't make her finger tremble, nor did it calm the razor edge of focus that held her still. It just was. The Marine unit that had escorted her to this overwatch position was spread out behind her, crouched in cover, their weapons ready but useless at this range. Some of them had smirked when they first saw her setting up, a lean, quiet woman in a ghillie suit, dwarfed by the massive rifle she carried like it was an extension of herself. They'd heard she was good, but 2,800 meters was beyond the realm of belief for most shooters, and disbelief had flickered in their eyes. She'd ignored it. The shot she was about to take wasn't about impressing them. It was about ending a monster before he could disappear again into the spiderweb of tunnels and safe houses that made him untouchable. A faint tremor rippled through the air, and she adjusted her windage dial by a fraction of a click, her gloved fingers moving with surgical precision. She'd memorized every variable: the air temperature, the humidity, the altitude, and the way the thin mountain winds curled through the valleys like restless spirits. She knew the Coriolis effect at this latitude, the spin drift that would nudge the bullet's trajectory ever so slightly to the right, and the drop-over distance that would turn a straight shot into a graceful arc, a silent parabola of death. Her spotter lay to her left, a broad-shouldered man with a weathered face and eyes like polished steel, murmuring occasional data into her earpiece. 2850. Winds shifting. Quarter value left to right. She made another microscopic adjustment and exhaled slowly, counting in her head, steadying the rhythm of her body until she could feel her pulse through the rifle's stock. The Marines were silent now, the smirks gone, replaced by the kind of tension that clamped down on men's chests when history was about to be written. She blocked them out, narrowing her entire existence down to the man on the ridgeline. She imagined the path of the bullet, saw it cutting through the thin air like a phantom, reaching across an impossible stretch of land to meet him before he even heard the sound of the shot. The world seemed to contract, every sound fading into nothingness except the whisper of the wind and the slow inhale-exhale cycle that was as precise as the ticking of a metronome. She eased her finger onto the trigger, the cold curve fitting perfectly beneath the pad of her fingertip. Time became elastic, stretching out until a second felt like a lifetime, her focus so absolute it was as if she had become the rifle itself, a living instrument of steel and flesh. The target paused, raising a hand to shade his eyes from the sun just beginning to crest the mountains, his face momentarily exposed in the harsh light. She saw the lines etched into his skin, the arrogance in his posture, and the casual cruelty in his expression even from this distance. It was all she needed. Her breath left her in one long even exhale, and she squeezed the trigger with a motion so gentle it barely seemed like movement at all. The rifle thundered, a deep, concussive sound that shattered the silence and rolled across the mountains like distant thunder. The recoil was solid but familiar, absorbed by her shoulder as the muzzle brake kicked up a burst of dust and debris. The bullet was already slicing through the air, traveling faster than sound, and she tracked its invisible journey in her mind, calculating every adjustment she had made as if time itself had slowed to let her witness what came next. 2.8 kilometers away, the man's head snapped back with a violent jerk, his body crumpling to the ground like a puppet with its strings cut. The guards around him froze in shock, confusion etched on their faces as the reality of what had happened sank in. It would be seconds before they reacted, seconds before chaos erupted, but her shot was already complete, perfect, and final. The spotter's voice was calm, a quiet affirmation in her ear. Impact. Target down. She didn't smile, didn't flinch, didn't even allow herself a moment of triumph. She was already chambering another round, scanning for secondary targets, her body still welded to the rifle. The Marines behind her were whispering in disbelief, their earlier skepticism evaporated, replaced by something close to reverence. The warlord was dead, and they all knew they had just witnessed something extraordinary, a shot that would be talked about for years. But to her it was just another mission. Another name crossed off a list she kept locked in her mind, a list that seemed to grow longer no matter how many she erased. Her hands moved on instinct, cycling the bolt, her breathing steady, her heartbeat calm. The adrenaline hadn't even begun to fade yet, and she wouldn't let it. Not while the battlefield still breathed, not while there was a chance someone might try to retaliate. The mission wasn't over. Not yet. She adjusted her scope, scanning the ridgeline, watching as the guards scrambled for cover, shouting into radios, their panic spreading like wildfire. Her finger rested lightly on the trigger again, and she whispered into her comms, her voice steady as stone, "Send the signal. It's done." The radio crackled softly in her ear as the team leader acknowledged her words, his voice calm but edged with urgency, and she watched through her scope as the 1st Marine Fire Team moved from their concealed positions to secure the area. The mountain pass was alive now, a hornet's nest kicked wide open by her single shot, and she could already see enemy fighters scrambling out of the stone bunkers and crude shelters carved into the cliffside. They were confused, disoriented, trying to figure out where death had come from, but that chaos wouldn't last long. The warlord's men were seasoned killers, hardened by years of guerrilla warfare in these unforgiving mountains, and their instincts would kick in soon enough. She breathed deeply, letting her heartbeat settle into that same meditative rhythm, scanning the battlefield with her finger. Hovering over the trigger, picking her targets with the patience of a hunter. Another fighter darted from behind a boulder, his head turning frantically as he shouted orders into a radio. She took him in a heartbeat, the rifle kicking against her shoulder as his body folded mid-stride, and before the dust from her muzzle brake even settled, she shifted to the next. Her spotter whispered adjustments, feeding her wind calls and range estimates, and she worked with him like a machine, every movement fluid and deliberate. Behind her, the Marines advanced cautiously, their boots crunching against loose gravel, their rifles trained on every shadow, their nerves taut as wire. She could sense their unease. Most of them had never seen combat in terrain like this, where every ridgeline was a potential kill zone, and the enemy knew every trail, every hiding place. The wind picked up, whistling softly through the rocks, carrying the faint scent of gunpowder and dust. She kept firing in precise rhythm, one shot every few seconds, each crack of the rifle echoing like thunderclaps in the thin mountain air. The guards near the bunker were dropping one by one, their numbers thinning with terrifying speed, and still the enemy couldn't find her position. She had chosen her perch with obsessive care, studying maps and drone footage for days before the operation. The plateau where she lay was a natural sniper's nest, a jagged outcrop of rock that gave her a panoramic view of the valley below while keeping her silhouette hidden. Even if they suspected her location, getting a bead on her would be nearly impossible. The Marines had set up decoy firing positions around her, baiting the enemy's return fire away from her exact spot, and she could hear the occasional staccato bursts of machine gun fire as those decoys drew attention. She didn't flinch at the sound. Her entire world was still narrowed down to her scope, the faint crosshairs settling over another man as he popped his head above a sandbag wall. One squeeze, one thunderclap, another lifeless body slumping into the dirt. Her discipline was absolute. She didn't revel in it, didn't gloat over the impossible shots that left her comrades whispering in awe. This was her craft, her calling, honed over years of brutal training and endless repetition. Her mind drifted briefly, in those milliseconds between targets, to the first time she'd held a rifle, back when she was a teenager fresh out of school, her hands trembling as she lined up her first target on a makeshift range. She had been fascinated by the calm it required, the stillness, the sense of control over something so lethal. That fascination had hardened into skill, and that skill had been sharpened into legend by war after war, mission after mission. She was a ghost now, a phantom on the battlefield whose name carried weight in whispers, and yet she felt no pride, no ego. This was simply what she did, what she was made for. The Marines behind her were pinned down now as a hail of enemy gunfire erupted from the cliffside. Bullets cracked overhead, pinging off rocks, and the sharp smell of cordite filled the air as the team returned fire. She adjusted her position, angling her rifle toward the bunker entrance, where two fighters had appeared with a heavy machine gun, dragging it into place. She calculated the shot in an instant and took it, her bullet slicing through one man's chest, dropping him before he could even shoulder the weapon. His partner dove for cover, shouting orders, but she fired again, the crack of her rifle echoing off the valley walls, and the second man fell in a spray of dust and debris. The machine gun lay abandoned, its barrel gleaming in the sunlight, and she whispered into her comms, her voice calm despite the chaos. "Machine gun down. Push forward." The squad leader's acknowledgement came immediately, and she could see the Marines moving, sprinting between cover, their discipline impeccable despite the danger. She tracked them for a moment, ensuring their path was clear, before shifting her focus back to the battlefield. Her spotter called out a sniper threat on the opposite ridge, and she swung her scope in that direction, scanning for the faint glint of glass or movement. There, a flash of light just for a split second, and she zeroed in. Her heart rate slowed even further and she squeezed the trigger. The enemy sniper never fired a shot. His rifle clattered down the rocks as his body went limp, sliding down the slope. "Threat neutralized," she murmured, and her spotter's approving grunt was all the praise she needed. The battlefield was shifting now, the initial panic of the enemy giving way to organized resistance. More fighters were flooding out of hidden tunnels, their shouts echoing across the mountains, and she could feel the tension rising. The Marines were making progress, inching closer to the bunker, but the fight was far from over. She scanned for the next threat, her mind working like a computer, processing wind, distance, movement, and angles with machine-like precision. She fired again and again, each shot a punctuation mark in the chaos, cutting down threats before they could overwhelm her team. Sweat beaded on her forehead beneath her helmet, but her breathing never faltered. She adjusted her bipod slightly, feeling the shift of the rifle's weight, and her world shrank back into that tunnel of focus. She could hear faint voices behind her now, Marines whispering in awe, their earlier skepticism gone, replaced by an almost superstitious respect. To them she was something out of legend, a sniper who could bend physics to her will. But she didn't care about their awe or their respect. All that mattered was the mission, the lives she was protecting, and the precision of her craft. She could feel the tension in the air, the electricity that always came before a battle reached its climax, and she knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Somewhere in the chaos, a voice barked orders, deeper and louder than the others, and her instincts told her the enemy's new commander had taken charge. She scanned the ridgeline, searching for that voice's source, and her finger tightened on the trigger. The fight was about to get harder. She shifted her body slightly, every movement slow and deliberate, adjusting her scope as she scanned the jagged ridgeline where the commanding voice had echoed from moments before, her instincts on high alert, every nerve sharp as a razor's edge. The wind was changing again, swirling unpredictably through the valley, carrying with it dust and the faint smell of burning cordite, and she adjusted for it almost unconsciously, her fingers twisting the windage knob by a fraction of a click. Her spotter murmured numbers softly, barely audible over the low hiss of static in their radios, and she soaked them in like a musician hearing notes to a familiar song. Somewhere out there was a man coordinating the chaos, barking orders with a voice that cut through the gunfire, a voice that had already begun to bring discipline to the scattered enemy fighters. She knew what that meant. He wasn't just some random insurgent leader, this was someone trained, someone dangerous. Her scope traced over a cluster of rocks that looked suspiciously like a sniper's hide, then shifted again toward a shadowed outcrop where the movement of a scarf betrayed a lookout's position. She squeezed the trigger smoothly, her shot breaking with a deep crack that echoed across the valley, and the man fell backward, his weapon clattering. Down the rocks. The Marines below were advancing in careful bursts, moving from cover to cover with professional precision, but even she could see how quickly the battlefield was changing. The enemy was beginning to rally, gunfire growing more coordinated, bursts of automatic fire raking the slopes with alarming accuracy. A rocket-propelled grenade streaked across the valley, exploding against the rocky slope near one of the Marines' positions, showering them with debris, and for the first time since the mission started, she felt a surge of urgency tighten in her chest. Her hands stayed steady, her breathing controlled, but she knew they were walking into the teeth of a trap. She pressed her cheek harder against the rifle stock, scanning quickly for threats, and spotted the faint silhouette of a man hefting another RPG launcher on a distant ridge. She dialed in the range, calculating the distance in a heartbeat, and squeezed the trigger. The shot landed cleanly, the man collapsing before he could even aim, and she immediately cycled the bolt, scanning for the next target. Her spotter's voice was calm, reassuring, and she felt that steadying presence like a lifeline, anchoring her in the chaos. "Nice shot," he murmured. 2 o'clock, next threat, look for the glint. She swung her rifle right, narrowing her eyes as she scanned the jagged rock face. There, a flash of sunlight off a scope. She fired without hesitation, the rifle bucking against her shoulder, and another sniper threat disappeared from the board. But the voice barking orders was still out there, louder now, driving the enemy fighters like a conductor leading an orchestra of gunfire. She slowed her breathing even more, letting her heartbeat settle, letting herself sink into that state of cold focus she had trained years to master. She knew she had to find him. Killing this commander would be the key to breaking the enemy's organization before it could fully solidify. She scanned methodically, inch by inch, through her high-powered scope, tracing every shadow, every crevice, every patch of movement. The Marines below had reached the halfway point to the bunker now, their progress painfully slow under constant fire. Bullets sparked off rocks around them, and one man stumbled as a round grazed his helmet, dropping behind cover with a muffled curse. She shifted again, eyes flicking over a distant rocky ledge where she caught sight of a head ducking down quickly. Her gut told her this was it. She dialed in, adjusting elevation and windage in micro-increments, feeling the faint shift in air pressure against her face. The man appeared again for a split second, holding a pair of binoculars and shouting something into a radio, and that was all she needed. Her finger tightened on the trigger and the rifle roared. The commander fell backward in an almost graceful arc, tumbling down the rocks, his radio clattering out of his hand. Immediately the enemy's gunfire faltered, the intensity dropping as confusion rippled through their ranks. She exhaled slowly, the familiar calm washing over her as she chambered another round. "Target eliminated," she said softly into her comms. "Push forward." The Marines seized the opportunity, surging ahead under the sudden lull in fire, their boots pounding over gravel and stone as they closed the distance to the bunker. She tracked them through her scope, picking off fighters who dared to expose themselves, each shot clearing the way for the advancing squad. The rhythm of battle was changing now, the balance of power tilting back in their favor. But she knew it wasn't over. Not yet. These mountains were a labyrinth of tunnels and hidden passages. Even without their commander, the enemy could regroup quickly. She stayed sharp, her scope sweeping back and forth like a predator's gaze, searching for any sign of movement. Her spotter's calm voice was a constant presence, feeding her data, confirming kills, and warning her of threats she might not have noticed in time. They worked in perfect sync, like two halves of a single machine, their communication efficient and understated. The Marines reached the outer perimeter of the bunker, using hand signals to coordinate as they stacked up by the entrance. She could see the tension in their stances, the readiness in their movements. They were about to breach, and that meant things were about to get messy. She shifted her position slightly, bracing for the chaos she knew would erupt once they went inside. Her finger rested lightly on the trigger, her breathing even, her focus absolute. Through her earpiece, she heard the muffled thump of explosives as they breached the bunker door, followed by a burst of gunfire and shouted commands. The interior fight had begun. She scanned the ridgeline again, her instincts screaming that this wasn't finished, that there was something they hadn't seen yet. The air felt heavier somehow, charged with tension. She adjusted her scope, sweeping back over the rocky outcrops, and that's when she saw it, a glimmer of movement far above at the very top of the cliff. She zoomed in, her breath catching slightly as she spotted two men hauling a massive crate into position, their movements hurried and desperate. Her mind processed the shape instantly. It was a heavy machine gun, belt-fed, with a clear line of fire down into the valley where the Marines were pinned against the bunker. If they set it up, her entire team would be caught in a kill zone with no cover. She whispered urgently into her comms, "Heavy gun incoming, High Ridge, 12 o'clock. The squad leader cursed under his breath, but they had no way of stopping it from their position. It was on her. She adjusted her scope, dialing in the range, over 1,900 meters, an awkward upward angle, wind swirling unpredictably at this altitude. She steadied her breathing, shutting out everything else. One man bent down to feed the ammunition belt into the gun, while the other swung the barrel toward the Marine's position. She fired, the shot breaking like thunder, and the man feeding the belt dropped instantly, his body crumpling over the weapon. The other man panicked, fumbling with the gun, and she fired again, sending him sprawling backward. The machine gun toppled over the edge of the cliff, tumbling down the rocks with a clatter that echoed like distant applause. She exhaled slowly, chambering another round, scanning for more threats. Her spotter gave her a nod of approval, a rare smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Saved their asses with that one," he murmured. But she didn't smile back. Not yet. The fight was still raging inside the bunker, muffled bursts of gunfire echoing from within, and she knew the real danger was still lurking below ground, in those twisting tunnels where every corner could hide death. She refocused, eyes narrowing through the scope, ready to support her team until every last threat was gone. The gunfire inside the bunker was a constant, stuttering rhythm now, muffled by layers of rock but carrying enough weight to vibrate through the ground beneath her. She kept her cheek pressed to the rifle stock, her breathing slow and controlled, eyes sweeping the terrain with mechanical precision. The Marines had breached and were deep into the structure, clearing room by room, while outside the battlefield had gone eerily quiet. It wasn't peace though, it was the heavy, oppressive stillness that only came when men were regrouping, reloading, planning their counterstrike. She adjusted her scope, scanning the high ridgelines and shadowed crevices with relentless patience, her finger hovering over the trigger. Her spotter was whispering updates softly, calling wind shifts, tracking thermal signatures from their portable sensor. Movement north ridge, he murmured. She shifted her scope in the indicated direction, zooming in on a narrow ledge where three figures crept low against the rocks. They were moving with purpose, their weapons slung for speed, their gazes fixed on the plateau where she and the spotter were concealed. Her instincts sharpened instantly. Counter-sniper team, she breathed, already adjusting her aim. The lead figure paused, scanning the cliffside through binoculars, and she squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked and he dropped without a sound, his binoculars clattering to the stone. The other two scrambled for cover, but she tracked them methodically, putting rounds through their hiding spots with surgical precision, forcing them to stay pinned. Her spotter called out corrections, his calm tone like steel in the storm, and she adjusted slightly, sending another bullet snapping through the gap in a boulder. The second man fell, his rifle tumbling down the rocks. The last fighter made a desperate sprint for another position, but she was faster. One smooth trigger squeeze and he crumpled mid-stride. She cycled the bolt, chambering another round, and exhaled slowly, scanning for more threats. Her comms crackled to life as the Marine squad leader's voice cut through the static. Bunkers clear. We've got intel and prisoners, but there are more tunnels below. Looks like they're preparing a counterattack. We'll need extraction ASAP. Her eyes narrowed slightly at the word tunnels. She knew what that meant. This wasn't just a forward outpost, it was part of a network, a fortress carved into the bones of the mountains with exits and entrances they hadn't even discovered yet. The warlord's death was a massive blow, but his network wouldn't collapse overnight. They were in the hornet's nest now, and every second they stayed here increased the risk of being overrun. She adjusted her position slightly, her body protesting after hours of stillness, but she ignored the discomfort. Her world was her rifle, her scope, and the battlefield laid bare before her. She spotted movement again, a small squad emerging from a crack in the cliffside far to the east, likely an auxiliary entrance. They were moving low and fast, their weapons ready, and she could see from their formation that these weren't grunts. These were professionals, possibly mercenaries, brought in to protect the warlord. She whispered a range estimate, dialed in her scope, and took the lead man out before he even realized he'd been spotted. The others scattered, but she followed them like a predator stalking prey, dropping two more with rapid, precise shots. The survivors vanished into the rocks and she scanned carefully, waiting for them to reappear. Her heartbeat was steady, her breathing even, but her mind was razor-sharp, calculating every angle, every potential threat. She could feel the tension tightening around her team like a noose. They were outnumbered, deep in enemy territory, and their only advantage was her overwatch position. She intended to make it count. The Marines had begun exfil preparations, moving their prisoners and gathered intel to a defensible position near the bunker entrance. She could hear their clipped voices over the comms, their discipline unshaken despite the danger. Her spotter muttered, "Contact, southwest ridge," and she swung her rifle in that direction, catching sight of another sniper team setting up. They were fast, experienced. She could see the glint of a high-end scope and the calm efficiency of their movements. She had seconds before they locked onto her position. She slowed her breathing even more, letting her body go perfectly still, and then squeezed the trigger. Her bullet shattered the enemy's scope, sending glass fragments into the sniper's face. He recoiled, blood spraying, and she shifted instantly to his partner, dropping him with a clean shot to the chest. The first man tried to crawl away, clutching his ruined face, but she didn't let him get far. One more pull of the trigger and he was still. She exhaled slowly, her body relaxing into its rhythm again. The battlefield was alive with unseen movement now, enemy fighters maneuvering through hidden paths, trying to find an angle she couldn't cover. She tracked them relentlessly, cutting down threats as soon as they revealed themselves, but she knew it was only a matter of time before they tried something desperate. Her comms buzzed again, this time with the low voice of the extraction pilot. "Birds inbound." ETA 10 minutes. Be ready to move. 10 minutes. It might as well have been a lifetime in a fight like this. She settled back behind her rifle, eyes scanning constantly, her mind working like a computer. She thought about her training, the endless hours spent on ranges in deserts and mountains, practicing shots in every condition imaginable. She remembered the instructors who'd pushed her to her limits, who'd drilled into her that a sniper wasn't just a shooter, they were a guardian angel, a force multiplier, a psychological weapon. She felt that truth in every breath she took, in every squeeze of the trigger that turned the tide of battle in her team's favor. Her spotter was quiet now, his eyes glued to his spotting scope, his fingers tracing coordinates on a tablet as he tracked enemy positions. They were a well-oiled machine, the culmination of years of experience, their bond forged in missions just like this one. She didn't need words to know what he was thinking. They had both been in situations where a single mistake could cost an entire squad's lives. She adjusted her bipod slightly, feeling the subtle shift in balance, and refocused on a cluster of enemy fighters moving cautiously along a narrow ledge. She fired, and one fell, his scream echoing through the valley as his body tumbled into the rocks below. The others scattered, but she hunted them down, one by one, her breathing steady, her finger precise. She didn't miss. She couldn't afford to. The Marines were tightening their perimeter now, setting up defensive positions and readying for extraction. The prisoners were restrained, their faces pale with fear, and she could see from their expressions that they understood what was happening. This wasn't just a raid, it was a death blow to their organization. She scanned again, her scope sweeping the terrain in a slow, methodical rhythm, and that's when she caught sight of something unusual, a flash of light from a high point far beyond the immediate battlefield, at the edge of her rifle's range. She zoomed in, her breath catching slightly when she saw what it was. A man, cloaked in camouflage, lying prone behind a rifle as long as hers, aiming not at her but at the Marines below. This wasn't just another sniper. She could tell from the man's posture, his setup, that he was an expert. He was her equal, or worse. Her heartbeat slowed to a crawl, her senses sharpening. This was a duel now, a test of everything she'd ever learned. She whispered into her comms, "Counter-sniper. Range 3,000. Her spotter's breath hissed sharply. 3,000? That's impossible. She ignored him, her eyes locked on the target. She dialed her scope carefully, adjusting for the insane distance, her mind calculating bullet drop, wind drift, even the Earth's curvature at this range. The enemy sniper was adjusting his aim, completely unaware that he was in her sights. She exhaled, her finger tightening on the trigger, and in that moment time seemed to slow. This was the shot of her life, the kind that would either save her entire team or doom them all. The world around her disappeared as she locked onto the rival sniper's position, everything beyond the narrow circle of her scope dissolving into a haze of insignificance. Even the chaos of gunfire below became nothing more than faint static in the distance. She became utterly still, her breathing slow and rhythmic, her finger resting lightly on the trigger as her mind raced through every calculation. 3,000 meters. It was beyond extreme range, beyond what most snipers would even attempt, but she'd spent her entire life training for the impossible. The rifle felt like an extension of her body, perfectly balanced, its weight familiar and comforting as she adjusted the elevation turret to compensate for the bullet's drop over nearly 2 miles of air. Her spotter was murmuring numbers in a steady stream, wind speed, barometric pressure, angle of elevation, and she absorbed each one like they were parts of an intricate puzzle, piecing them together with a kind of instinct that came only from years of experience. The rival sniper hadn't seen her yet. He was focused entirely on her team, his barrel aimed down at the Marines as they worked to secure their position and prepare for extraction. She could almost feel his confidence radiating through the scope, the way he lay calm and patient, waiting for his perfect shot. That kind of calm meant he wasn't just good, he was one of the best. She knew his type, men who had hunted others across battlefields, men who turned killing into an art. She also knew that he'd kill her brothers in arms without hesitation if she made one mistake. Her breath slowed even further, and she felt her pulse in her fingertips, counting the rhythm until it matched the precise moment she trained for, the natural respiratory pause between heartbeats. The wind shifted, a subtle gust curling through the valley, and she felt it on her cheek, a whisper that only she could interpret. She adjusted a quarter click, barely enough to notice but critical. Through the scope, she watched the sniper settle into his shot, his finger curling around his own trigger, and she knew she had only a heartbeat to act. She exhaled completely, her body becoming stone, her mind narrowing down to a single point of focus. When she squeezed the trigger, the world erupted with the familiar concussive roar of her rifle, but to her it felt like silence. The bullet was already in motion, cutting through the thin air, following the perfect arc she'd visualized in her mind. At this range, it would take more than a second to reach him, a strange eternity in the world of snipers, and she used that second to imagine the line it traced through space, a whisper of steel racing death itself. She saw him flinch, just slightly, as if he'd sensed something, but it was too late. Her round struck him square in the head, snapping his neck back violently, his body going limp as his rifle slid from his hands. For a fraction of a second, she just watched him, confirming the kill, her expression unreadable. Then she exhaled again, chambering another round with the same calm precision as before, as though she hadn't just pulled off a shot that defied reason. Her spotter let out a low whistle, his voice carrying a mix of awe and disbelief. 3,000 meters. Christ. That's not shooting. That's sorcery. She ignored him, already scanning for other threats, her focus as sharp as ever. But she felt something deep inside her shift, an acknowledgement that this shot, this moment, would follow her for the rest of her life. She had just saved her entire squad with a bullet fired from nearly 2 miles away. The Marines on the ground were moving quickly now, pushing toward the extraction point with renewed confidence. The death of the rival sniper had broken the enemy's momentum. Without their commander or their overwatch, their attacks were becoming sporadic and desperate. Still, she didn't relax. Not here. Not yet. Her eyes swept the battlefield, catching glimpses of enemy fighters retreating into the tunnels, dragging their wounded with them. This fight wasn't over, it was simply shifting, turning into something darker and more unpredictable. Her radio crackled again, the squad leader's voice cutting through. We're moving. 2 minutes to extraction. Keep Overwatch tight. She acknowledged with a curt copy, her eyes never leaving her scope. The helicopter's distant rotors were already humming in the distance, a low thrum that grew steadily louder. It was both a relief and a warning. Extraction was coming, but that sound would also draw every remaining fighter like a beacon. She tracked movement again, spotting a group of insurgents climbing a slope with RPG launchers slung over their backs. They were trying to get into position to fire on the incoming bird. She didn't hesitate. Her first shot took the lead man out instantly, the others scattering in panic. She cycled the bolt and fired again, dropping another before he could even draw his weapon. The last one scrambled for cover, fumbling with his launcher, but she was faster. One clean shot through his shoulder sent him sprawling, his weapon skittering out of reach. The Marines below were sprinting now, their formation tight as they carried their prisoners and intel toward the landing zone. The helicopter roared closer, dust whipping up in swirling clouds as it descended. She stayed perfectly calm, her breathing even, her rifle sweeping like a watchful sentinel. Every time a head popped up, every time an enemy dared to break cover, her rifle spoke, each shot precise and final. Her spotter was calling targets now, his voice clipped and efficient, and she worked with him in perfect harmony, covering every angle. The landing zone was becoming a storm of dust and noise, the rotor wash hammering the rocks and sending grit into the air, but she didn't flinch. Her rifle was steady, her focus unshakable, as the Marines boarded the bird one by one. She tracked their movement, firing at any threat that dared to approach. The sound of gunfire was deafening now, a chaotic chorus of automatic bursts, shouting and rotor blades, but she was calm, detached, operating in that narrow tunnel of clarity that made her one of the most lethal snipers alive. She stayed prone even as the Marines waved for her to move, covering them until the last possible second. Only when her spotter tapped her shoulder did she finally rise, moving with swift efficiency, her rifle cradled against her body as they sprinted toward the helicopter. Bullets snapped past them, kicking up dust at their heels, but she didn't break stride, sliding into the bird with practiced precision as her spotter followed. The crew chief hauled them in, slamming the side door shut as the pilot lifted off, the helicopter banking hard to escape the kill zone. Through the open side, she watched the battlefield shrink below, the valley twisting away into a jagged labyrinth of rock and shadow. The bunker was still there, silent now, its defenders either dead or fleeing, its secrets ripped out and carried away in the bird's hold. She sat against the wall of the helicopter, her breathing steady, her expression unreadable behind her dust-streaked face paint. The Marines were buzzing with adrenaline, clapping each other on the back, their voices loud over the roar of the engines. One of them glanced at her with wide eyes, shaking his head in disbelief. "I've seen a lot of shots," he said, "but that one? I didn't think anyone could even make a shot like that." She didn't respond, just started stripping down her rifle, wiping dust from its barrel with calm, deliberate motions. To her it wasn't about glory or records. It was about doing her job, about making sure every one of those men got home alive. She felt the familiar ache in her shoulders, the stiffness in her legs after hours of lying prone, but her mind was already moving ahead, analyzing what had happened, thinking about the tunnels, the network, the men who had escaped. This battle was over, but the war was far from finished. She glanced at her spotter, who gave her a nod, his eyes still wide with the shock of what they'd just accomplished. "Hell of a day," he muttered. She didn't answer. She was already running through the shot in her mind again, every calculation, every adjustment, every fraction of a second that had led to that perfect kill. It wasn't pride that drove her to replay it, it was obsession, the relentless drive to refine her craft. Because she knew that next time, the stakes might be even higher. The helicopter sliced through the mountain winds with brutal force, its rotors howling as the pilots pushed it to maximum speed, but she couldn't shake the tension tightening in her gut. Years of combat had sharpened her instincts to an edge, and every nerve in her body screamed that something wasn't right. She scanned the terrain through the open side door, her sniper rifle balanced across her knees, and the jagged ridges below looked far too quiet. There should have been signs of enemy retreat, sporadic fire from the ground, something to suggest that they'd broken the enemy's will. Instead, it felt like they'd flown straight into a predator's waiting jaws. Her spotter sensed it too. He leaned close, his voice low so the Marines wouldn't hear. "They're regrouping. That network of tunnels wasn't just an outpost, it's a staging point. We woke up a hornet's nest." She nodded slightly, her eyes never leaving the valleys below, and that was when she saw it. A flash of movement along a distant ridge, sunlight glinting off something metallic. Her stomach dropped. "Missile!" she yelled, her voice cutting through the roar of the rotors, and before the crew chief could react, a plume of white smoke erupted from the ridge. The missile streaked toward them like a spear of fire. The pilot banked hard, throwing the helicopter into a violent dive that pinned everyone to their seats. The missile arced, adjusted, and streaked past, missing them by only a few meters before exploding in a deafening blast that rocked the bird. The Marines cursed and clutched their rifles, some of them gripping the seats in white-knuckled terror. She was already moving, crawling to the edge of the bird and snapping her rifle up to her shoulder, her scope zeroing in on the ridge where the smoke trail had originated. She spotted two insurgents scrambling to reload another launcher, their movements frantic but determined. She fired once, the bullet tearing through the first man's chest, and then cycled the bolt with calm precision, dropping the second before he could even aim. The pilot was shouting into the comms, calling for backup, while the helicopter bucked and weaved through the air, trying to stay unpredictable. But more smoke trails were rising now, not from one ridge but from several, the enemy's response precise and coordinated. They'd been waiting for this. The pilot cursed and threw the helicopter into another dive as a second missile streaked past, detonating so close that the concussion rattled her teeth. She gritted her jaw and switched to her carbine, leaning out of the door to fire at muzzle flashes below, laying down suppressive fire while her spotter grabbed the mounted machine gun and unleashed a hail of bullets into the ridges. The Marines were shouting, returning fire through the open doors, but it felt like they were surrounded by a storm of rockets and lead. One missile hit close enough to shower the bird with shrapnel, sparks flying as fragments tore into the metal skin of the fuselage. The bird lurched violently, alarms screaming in the cockpit, and she grabbed onto a harness strap to keep from being thrown out the door. "We're hit. Engine 2's smoking," the pilot roared. The crew chief's face went pale. "We can't keep this up, we'll get shot out of the sky." She slammed a fresh magazine into her carbine, her expression hard. "Then put us down somewhere they don't expect us," she said sharply. The pilot didn't argue. He yanked the controls hard, banking the helicopter toward a narrow canyon that wound like a serpent through the mountains. The sudden drop was stomach-churning, the walls of the canyon rushing past so close that she could see individual cracks in the rock. Gunfire echoed through the canyon, enemy fighters pouring fire from the cliffs above, but the maneuver gave them cover from most of the missile teams. She crawled back to her sniper rifle, bracing it against the helicopter's frame, and began picking off shooters along the canyon walls with surgical precision. Her spotter kept the machine gun blazing, cutting down anyone who tried to get too close, the bird's gunners adding their own furious fire to the mix. The canyon narrowed until the helicopter barely fit, the pilot flying with white-knuckled precision, the rotors kicking up dust and pebbles in a maelstrom of noise. Another burst of gunfire rattled the bird, bullets punching through the side and wounding one of the Marines. Blood sprayed across the cabin, and two of his brothers dragged him back, applying pressure to the wound as she fired again, dropping the shooter with a clean shot through the head. Her heart was hammering now, but her breathing stayed even. Panic was useless, precision was everything. The helicopter roared out of the canyon into a hidden valley, the terrain opening up into a maze of rocky outcroppings and scrub. The pilot spotted a flat stretch of dirt near a cluster of boulders and brought the bird down hard, skidding into the landing. "Everybody out," the crew chief bellowed. They didn't need to be told twice. The Marines jumped out, forming a defensive perimeter around the chopper, weapons raised. She and her spotter moved with practiced efficiency, setting up their rifles behind a low ridge that offered some cover. The downed bird hissed and smoked behind them, its damaged engine still whining. The valley was eerily silent for a moment, a calm that felt like the pause before a storm. And then the enemy came. Dozens of fighters poured over the ridges, their shouts echoing across the valley, bullets sparking off rocks as they charged. She dropped the first one before he even cleared the crest, then another, her rifle cracking with lethal rhythm. The Marines opened fire, the sound of automatic weapons filling the air as the valley erupted into chaos. The enemy moved like they'd planned this, advancing in waves trying to pin the team down and overwhelm them. But she was a wall of death, her rifle never missing, her movements smooth and efficient. She shifted targets constantly, prioritizing threats, her mind calculating angles and distances with icy precision. Her spotter reloaded the machine gun and unleashed another thunderous barrage, mowing down attackers who dared to get close. Grenades exploded nearby, showering them with dirt and fragments, but she didn't flinch, staying focused through the haze of dust and smoke. The Marines fought like demons, holding their ground despite being outnumbered, their training and discipline keeping them alive. She switched magazines without looking, her hands working automatically, and dropped 3 more fighters in quick succession. The enemy pressed harder, their numbers seemingly endless, but she felt no fear, only clarity. Every shot she took was deliberate, every movement honed by years of training and combat. But then she saw something that made her heart skip. A second wave of fighters cresting the ridge, this time carrying heavier weapons. RPG launchers, mortars, even a mounted machine gun dragged into position. Her mind worked fast, calculating distances, angles, and the inevitable conclusion. If they didn't act fast, they'd be overrun. She keyed her radio, her voice sharp and calm. "We need air support now." The pilot's voice crackled back, tight with stress. "Already called it, but closest bird is 15 minutes out." 15 minutes was a lifetime in this kind of fight. She didn't waste time arguing. "Then we hold." She swung her rifle toward the mortar team setting up on a ridge and fired, killing the gunner before he could drop a round into the tube. Her spotter joined her, switching to his own rifle to take out the assistant, buying precious seconds. But more enemies were flooding in, their shouts growing louder, their gunfire heavier. The Marines were shouting to each other, repositioning to cover angles, dragging the wounded behind cover. She crawled forward, finding a new firing spot, and started targeting the RPG gunners one by one, forcing them to take cover. The valley was a storm now, bullets kicking up dirt and ricocheting off rocks, grenades sending shockwaves through the air. Her heartbeat stayed steady, her breathing even, her rifle a metronome of death. But even as she fought, she knew this wasn't just a battle. It was a hunt, and the enemy wasn't going to stop until they were all dead or captured. She tightened her grip on the rifle, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the ridges for their commander. There was always a leader, someone orchestrating the chaos. If she could find him and take him out, it might buy them time. And time was all they needed to survive until air support arrived. The valley was alive with chaos, every rock and shadow becoming a battlefield. Bullets cracked overhead like snapping whips, ricocheting off stone and spraying shards of rock into the defenders' faces. Her lungs burned as she took a slow, measured breath, calming herself despite the hellstorm raging around her. She shifted her weight slightly, her cheek pressed against the rifle stock and lined up a shot. Through her scope, she spotted the flicker of movement. A man with binoculars crouched behind a ridge, barking orders into a radio. There. The commander. She exhaled slowly, squeezed the trigger, and the shot cracked like thunder. The man jerked back and crumpled, his radio falling to the dirt. Immediately, the enemy's fire wavered, their coordinated advance faltering for a precious few seconds. "Command down," she murmured into the radio. "They'll regroup, but that's their lead man." Her spotter gave her a grim nod, reloading his machine gun with trembling hands. "We've bought maybe 30 seconds, he muttered, glancing toward the ridges where muzzle flashes still blazed. "They've got numbers on their side." She didn't answer, she was already shifting positions, crawling through dust and blood-stained rocks to another perch. The smell of burned powder, scorched metal, and blood was thick in the air, clinging to her senses like a second skin. The downed helicopter smoldered behind them, its engine coughing smoke into the wind as Marines scrambled to fortify their position, dragging ammo crates into makeshift cover. A corpsman worked feverishly over the wounded Marine, his hands stained crimson, while another soldier shouted coordinates into a battered field radio, begging for faster support. Suddenly, a shrill whistle cut through the valley. She barely had time to shout, "Incoming!" before a mortar shell slammed into the dirt near their defensive line. The explosion ripped a crater into the earth, the shockwave knocking her flat, her ears ringing violently. She blinked through the haze, her vision swimming, and saw a Marine lying nearby, his body twisted unnaturally, his helmet gone. She gritted her teeth and shoved herself upright, crawling to her rifle. The enemy had brought in heavier weapons, and now their fire intensified, tracer rounds streaking through the dusk. "They're bracketing us," her spotter shouted over the gunfire, his voice raw. "Mortar teams on the east ridge." She swung her scope around, spotted the mortar squad frantically loading their tube and fired. The round punched through the loader's neck, dropping him instantly. The assistant gunner ducked, but not fast enough. Her next shot shattered his shoulder, sending him tumbling down the slope. She cycled the bolt smoothly, her focus razor-sharp despite the chaos. But more fighters surged over the western ridge, yelling war cries, RPGs slung over their backs. The Marines opened fire, mowing down several, but one insurgent managed to launch his rocket. The explosion tore through their makeshift barricade, splinters of rock and debris raining down as two Marines were hurled backward. One screamed in agony, clutching his bleeding leg while the other lay still, his body limp. She felt a flash of rage, sharp and cold. This wasn't just a firefight anymore. It was slaughter. They were trying to wipe her entire team off the map. "Focus fire on those RPGs," she barked, switching to rapid shots and dropping another attacker mid-stride. Her spotter gritted his teeth and swung the machine gun, cutting down 3 more insurgents as they charged down the ridge. Empty casings spilled like rain, bouncing off the rocks around him. The Marines rallied behind their cover, rifles blazing, their shouts mixing with the roar of battle. 5 minutes, the pilot yelled from the helicopter's wreckage, crouched over the radio. "Air support's 5 minutes out." 5 minutes. It might as well have been 5 years. They were running low on ammo, the wounded were stacking up, and every ridge seemed to vomit more fighters. She glanced at her last 2 sniper magazines and made a decision. "We push west," she told her spotter. "That ridge is their main staging point. We take it or we're done." Her spotter's eyes widened. "That's suicide. Not if we're faster than them." She slammed a fresh magazine into her carbine and rose into a crouch. "Cover me." Without waiting for agreement, she sprinted from cover, bullets snapping past her like angry bees. The Marines shouted in shock as she dashed across open ground, diving behind a boulder halfway to the ridge. Her spotter cursed and laid down heavy suppressive fire, forcing the attackers to duck. She popped up, firing controlled bursts, her training guiding every movement. The adrenaline coursing through her veins sharpened her world into stark detail. The crunch of gravel under her boots, the acrid scent of gunpowder, the glint of a rifle barrel in the rocks ahead. She dropped the shooter with a clean double tap and kept moving. By the time she reached the base of the ridge, her heart was hammering in her chest, but her breathing remained steady. Scrambled up the rocky slope, carbine slung tight against her chest, and tossed a flashbang over the crest. The detonation lit the dusk with a blinding flare, and she surged over the ridge, dropping 2 dazed fighters before they could react. The third managed to swing his AK toward her, but she sidestepped, grabbed his wrist and drove her combat knife into his throat. He gurgled and fell, blood spraying across the rocks. She didn't pause, she couldn't. Her spotter appeared at her side moments later, panting, his machine gun smoking. "We're clear," he started, but a burst of gunfire cut him off. He ducked, dragging her behind a rock as a squad of fighters charged up from the far side of the ridge. She dropped her empty carbine, yanked her pistol and fired point-blank into the lead attacker, then whipped her blade across another's face as he lunged. Her spotter emptied his sidearm into the rest, each shot echoing like thunder in the confined space. When the smoke cleared, 5 bodies lay sprawled on the rocks, their rifles clattering to the ground. "We hold here," she said, grabbing one of the enemy rifles and slamming a fresh magazine into it. "We stop them from using this ridge." Her spotter nodded grimly, dragging an enemy RPG launcher into position. They could see the entire valley from up here now, the Marines fighting tooth and nail around the downed bird, muzzle flashes strobing in the growing darkness. The enemy forces were massing for another push, forming a wave that threatened to drown the defenders. She raised the rifle, took aim and fired, cutting down a commander waving his men forward. Her spotter unleashed the RPG, the rocket screaming into a cluster of fighters and detonating with bone-shattering force. Screams echoed across the valley, but there was no time to celebrate. The enemy turned their focus on the ridge, pouring fire in their direction. Bullets chewed into the rocks, sparks flying as she ducked low and returned fire. "They want this ridge back," her spotter grunted. "Then we make them bleed for it." She switched back to her sniper rifle, using every lull in the incoming fire to drop targets with surgical precision. Each kill slowed the wave, bought her team precious seconds. But they were running out of ammo fast, scavenging from enemy rifles, stripping grenades from fallen fighters. The air reeked of cordite and death, the ground slick with blood. Suddenly a new sound split the night, a deep, distant roar that grew louder by the second. She risked a glance upward and felt relief flood her chest. Gunships. 2 Apache helicopters swept over the ridge, their cannons blazing. The battlefield erupted in explosions as Hellfire missiles slammed into enemy positions, scattering fighters like ants under boiling water. The Marines roared with renewed energy, surging forward as the Apaches unleashed hell from above. The tide had turned. She leaned back against the rocks, chest heaving, blood streaked across her face. Her spotter gave a hoarse laugh, half hysteria, half triumph. "We lived," he breathed. "For now," she muttered, reloading one of the captured rifles. Because deep down she knew this was only the beginning. Someone had organized this ambush, planned it with surgical precision. And they wouldn't stop until she and her team were dead. The battlefield was silent now, save for the groans of the wounded and the distant rumble of retreating gunfire. Smoke curled lazily from burning debris, drifting over the blood-soaked rocks like a dark shroud. The Apaches circled once more, their floodlights cutting harsh beams across the valley, before banking away toward their next objective. Without their deafening roar, the world felt eerily hollow, as if the chaos of moments ago had been swallowed whole by the night. She stood at the ridge's edge, rifle still slung tight across her chest, her eyes scanning the carnage below. The downed helicopter was a twisted wreck of scorched metal, its fuselage blackened but miraculously intact enough to have sheltered those huddled behind it. Bodies, both enemy and friendly, littered the field, sprawled unnaturally where they'd fallen. The acrid smell of cordite and burning fuel clung to the air, mixing with the metallic tang of blood. She closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling slowly through her nose, forcing the chaos in her head to settle. "Corpsman!" someone shouted hoarsely. She turned and saw a Marine kneeling over a fallen comrade, his hands pressed desperately against a wound in the man's chest. The corpsman sprinted over, his med kit clutched tight, and immediately began working. She walked past them, her boots crunching on shattered glass and shell casings, her rifle dangling loosely at her side. Everywhere she looked, Marines were moving with grim efficiency, dragging the wounded into a makeshift triage zone, scavenging ammunition from enemy weapons and reinforcing their perimeter. Her spotter approached, his face streaked with soot and blood, a ragged cut over his brow. He handed her a water canteen and she accepted it gratefully, taking a long swallow. "We counted 47 confirmed kills on this ridge alone," he said quietly. "Plus the ones we got before we pushed up. Whoever these bastards are, they weren't just a ragtag militia. They were trained. Well supplied." She wiped her mouth with the back of her glove, her jaw tightening. "I know," she muttered. "Look at their gear." She gestured toward a cluster of enemy rifles laid out on the ground. They weren't mismatched AKs or ancient carbines. These were modern weapons, sleek and deadly with custom optics and fresh serial numbers. Some of the fallen fighters still wore body armor, their uniforms stripped of any identifying insignia. Mercenaries, she thought grimly. Or worse. A Marine lieutenant approached, his face pale beneath streaks of dirt. "Captain wants you in the command post," he said, his voice hoarse. "Now." She nodded, slung her rifle across her back and followed him. The command post was a rough semicircle of sandbags and debris near the wrecked helicopter, where the pilot and the Marine captain hunched over a tablet, scanning maps and drone footage. Both looked up as she approached. "Sergeant," the captain said, his voice clipped but respectful. "That was a hell of a move taking that ridge. You saved us all." She gave a curt nod, unwilling to bask in praise. "We were dead if we stayed pinned down. That ridge was their choke point." The captain tapped his screen. "We've got fresh intel coming in from satellite recon. Enemy forces are pulling back to the east, but they're not scattering. They're regrouping." He zoomed in on the map, showing a cluster of heat signatures deeper in the valley. This wasn't a random ambush. They were trying to pin us here, cut off our exfil route, and finish us before reinforcements arrived. Someone fed them our flight plan. The words hit like a punch to the gut. Her fingers curled into fists at her sides. You're saying we were betrayed? The captain met her gaze, his expression grim. I'm saying this was too coordinated to be a coincidence. They knew exactly where we'd be and how long it would take for support to get here. She ground her teeth, anger simmering in her chest. Betrayal. It explained the precision of the ambush, the sheer numbers they'd faced, the mortars already pre-sighted on their landing zone. This wasn't a warlord's lucky break. This was surgical. The pilot, still nursing a bruised shoulder, glanced between them nervously. So what's the play? We've got wounded and my bird's not going anywhere. The captain exhaled sharply. We hold position until extraction. Reinforcements are inbound with medevac birds, but they're an hour out. An hour. She looked out over the battlefield again, her instincts screaming that they didn't have that long. The enemy wouldn't just regroup, they'd come back harder and they'd bring heavier firepower. She felt the tension thrumming in her muscles, the adrenaline refusing to ebb. We need to move, she said flatly. The captain frowned. Move where? We're boxed in on 3 sides. Unless you've got a secret route out of this canyon, we stay put and dig in. She didn't argue, yet. She turned on her heel and stalked back toward her spotter, who was helping distribute scavenged ammo. He looked up at her expression and knew immediately. What's the bad news? They're regrouping, she said bluntly. And they had our flight plan. Someone set us up. He let out a bitter laugh. Figures. She crouched beside him, lowering her voice. There's a ravine to the north. Steep, but it leads out of this canyon. If we move the wounded quietly, we can get them to higher ground before those bastards circle back. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. You'll never convince command to pull out early. Then we don't ask. For the next 30 minutes, she moved like a ghost through the triage zone, speaking softly to squad leaders, pointing out the ravine's location and quietly building consensus. The Marines trusted her. She'd earned that trust 100 times over, and tonight's assault only sealed it. By the time she returned to the ridge, most of the men were quietly packing gear, loading magazines and prepping stretchers. She knelt beside one of the wounded, a young Marine with shrapnel in his side. His face was pale, his breathing shallow. She squeezed his shoulder gently. We're getting you out of here, she whispered. His eyes flickered open and he managed a weak nod. Night deepened, stars emerging overhead, but the valley remained choked with smoke and the flickering glow of fires. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked eerie and hollow. She could feel the tension building, a sixth sense honed over years of combat. They weren't alone. Her spotter slid up beside her, his rifle cradled in his arms. Scouts say enemy movement on the east ridge. About 20 men creeping closer. She swore softly. We move now. The order rippled through the Marines with quiet efficiency. Stretchers were lifted, ammo slung, weapons readied. She led the column toward the northern ravine, every step deliberate, every breath shallow. The wounded groaned softly, but the men carrying them didn't falter. They moved like shadows, weaving through the rocks, keeping low. Halfway to the ravine, a gunshot cracked through the night. Then another. The enemy had spotted them. Shouts echoed across the valley as tracer rounds lit the darkness. Contact front, someone yelled, and chaos erupted again. Keep moving, she barked, dropping to one knee and firing into the muzzle flashes ahead. Her spotter's machine gun roared to life, cutting down attackers as the Marines pushed forward. Bullets zipped past her ear, sparks flying as rounds struck the rocks. She felt the familiar surge of adrenaline sharpen her senses to a razor's edge. Go. Get the wounded out, she screamed, covering the retreat. Her carbine clicked empty, she slammed in a new magazine, her hands steady despite the chaos. The enemy charged, but the Marines met them with fierce, disciplined fire, forcing them back long enough for the stretcher teams to vanish into the ravine. By the time she and her spotter reached the edge, her chest burned from exertion, her rifle smoking hot. Behind them, the enemy regrouped, but the ravine's steep walls offered some cover. She glanced back at the burning valley, rage twisting in her gut. This wasn't over. Someone had orchestrated this slaughter, and she intended to find out who. The end.